Good morning or afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. Welcome to the OTA webinar, Are You Protecting Your Email and Your Customers? Learnings from the 2017 OTA Trust Audit. We've done this the last few years as a follow-up to our annual online trust audit to kind of do a deeper dive into the email aspects of it. And I want to welcome you to the call today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There are kind of two ways you can interact with others that are on this webinar. There's a Q&A panel that you can open, and there's a chat panel. And from a question standpoint, we prefer that you use the Q&A. If you do type it into the chat panel, we'll see it, but we'd prefer that you use the Q&A. This is being recorded, so it will be posted on the OTA site in the next day or two. As will the slides in a PDF format, so you don't have to take copious notes. Want to introduce our panel that we have today. Kevin Gallant, the Manager of Intelligence Products from Yes Lifecycle Marketing. Peter Goldstein, CTO and co-founder of Valamail. Mike Jones, the Director of Product Management at Agari. And I'm Jeff Wilbur, Director of the Online Trust Initiative at the Internet Society. For those of you who may not be aware, OTA folded into the Internet Society earlier this year. In fact, we're just completing that transition. We're still operating somewhat independently with all our activities going forward, but we are now part of a bigger, broader, global-based nonprofit in the Internet Society, and we're excited about that. So today we're going to talk about email authentication, what we've seen in the audit, why should you be doing it and such. And the first couple things, it begs the question, why should you even care? And there are a couple angles on this. The first is there's a risk, and I think everyone knows this. It's not hard to pull from the headlines something about phishing and attacks. Study after study that come out over the years have shown that about 90% of breaches are initiated through a fake email of some kind, and we're seeing more and more of this. And these are just some clips from SC Media over the past few months that cover the DNC attack, Netflix membership, and tax scams. But as you probably all know, you could pick just about any story angle you want and find a variety of things. Be interested with the panelists, Peter, Mike, or Kevin. What have you seen out there that really strikes you as new attacks that are happening of late?
Sure, I'll take this. This is Peter. So one of the things we've really seen is an increase in basically ransom-based attacks. So malicious actors would contact a domain owner and threaten them with basically ask them to pay a Bitcoin ransom, or else they would carry out some action that impacts their reputation. So one of our customers was basically, their email was knocked out of commission because even though they sent a relatively small volume of email, when they didn't pay a blackmailer, that blackmailer sent millions of spam messages using their domain. And since they didn't have email authentication in place at the time, there was no distinction capable by receivers between the emails that were being generated by this botnet and the legitimate emails of the customer. And so effectively they were knocked off the internet from an email perspective.
That's an interesting double twist there, that they get fooled by an incoming email and then their email gets used against them on the outbound side. So that's an interesting one. So I think we all know that there are a lot of risks, and you see that, but what I think doesn't often get talked about enough is the value. So we have kind of three major value points here. I want to have our panelists kind of address each one. So Peter, you want to take that first one about protection?
Sure. When we think about email authentication, as kind of the last slide made clear, we're first and foremost usually thinking about it as a way to protect. And not only protect customers, which is often how DMARC and associated technologies have been portrayed in recent years, but also to protect our partners and employees. So a company, by getting itself authenticated, by getting to DMARC at enforcement, to getting email authentication fully in place, prevent the most effective types of attacks, those attacks that use the exact domain that really can't be detected by a person, except by, very subtle and inconsistent clues about the text of the message. That's especially important when the message is not just I'm going to have you click on a link and edit your information, but it's something where it's trying to get you to take an action. So for example, if it's a wire fraud attack where you're trying to get someone to wire money from the company to a bad actor, a W-2 attack where the email is simply asking you to send the W-2s for the company's employees, et cetera, or an invoice attack against a partner. And so doing email authentication correctly has that real benefit of protecting everyone in your ecosystem, the customers, the partners, and the employees.
Yeah, you've really hit on a couple of the key growth areas we saw when we did our cyber incident and breach report earlier this year. Both the ransomware, which you mentioned on the previous slide, and the business email compromise, I think they call it, attacks, where there's not even malware involved. You're just asking someone to do something, pretending to be their boss, for instance, and they do it. So very low tech in that sense, but very effective. Mike, you want to take this second one, which is really tied to what DMARC can give you in terms of reporting?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Jeff. So when an organization goes into a project to implement DMARC, it's usually with that first bullet in mind, as far as protecting their customers, their partners, and employees, and as it should be, like that. That's always the top of mind, is securing your email channel and your brand. But one of the first bits of value that an organization really sees when they implement a DMARC policy is they see a view of their email that they've never had before. And that's because DMARC gives you the reporting from the perspective of all the email receivers out there. So email's messy and you don't control all of it. So while as an email administrator, you might have visibility into the email that's going out from the servers that you control, you don't have visibility into all the other external sources to answer the big picture question of like, who is sending email as me or as my brand? And the insight and visibility from DMARC gives you instant access almost to those, or instant answers to those questions, really. Like you can see right away what are all the third parties sending as me? What are all the malicious sources sending as me? What are all my legitimate sources that I didn't know about, like other business units within my organization, for example. And then you also get the ability to monitor changes in those senders over time as well.
Fantastic. And Kevin, how about the deliverability value? What do you see there?
Yeah, absolutely. Along with what both Mike and Peter said, the deliverability aspect really, when it comes to the authentication portions of your email, we're typically looking at the marketer's specific domain level. So what happens is if you're not authenticating your email, the ISPs, I mean, I'm sure it's no surprise, but they've over the years, the SPF DKIM records have become an absolute standard for delivery for any marketing messages or transactional messages that are coming from a brand marketer. So it's really not about it's really about keeping up with maintaining the proper authentication. And now with DMARC in place, the ability to evolve really into a combination of both DKIM and SPF records now to protect yourself. We're still in the transition period where we'll probably get into it a bit more on this call, but in terms of being able to keep up with what's happening and where the internet service providers are moving toward, having a DMARC policy in place that is set to reject or quarantine is certainly going to benefit the overall reputation and standard of how you're sending to those receivers. So that it's a huge win for the two other bullet points on there, but the deliverability of maintaining your integrity and your reputation in the industry is huge for utilizing both DMARC, SPF, and DKIM.
Great. So we've talked about why should you care. Let's look a little bit at who is caring lately. Here we have a sampling of headlines from governments. We've got the government of the UK talking about requiring email authentication to be used. We've got the US FTC talking about how businesses should be using email authentication. SC Magazine talking about within the US government push to have better adoption and then finally Microsoft using DMARC and kind of completing the whole thing, both on inbound and outbound use in their cloud services. So wanted to just throw it out to any of you. What kind of trends? These are some little snapshots, but what kind of trends are you seeing in terms of who is starting to adopt and push for full adoption of email authentication, including DMARC?
Hey, Jeff, this is Mike. I just wanted to jump in, not necessarily trends and who's adopting, but this is really exciting to me, this slide, especially seeing kind of the government organizations who are promoting Senator Wyden. I mean, I've been doing this for a number of years. I've done this webinar in past years as well. And a lot of the early years of DMARC, it's been about those of us who were kind of involved from the early stages, trying to educate businesses and policymakers that there is something that can be done about this phishing problem from you as a domain owner, as opposed to just depending on filtering services at the receiving end. And this shows me that word is actually getting out there. We're not just preaching to the choir anymore, telling other email authentication wonks what's going on. We're actually, the message is getting out there and it's becoming widespread. Enterprises, policymakers are recognizing that this is important and that businesses should be doing this. And really, businesses, I think we're going to get to a point where if businesses don't do this, it'll be actually a negative mark against them, because they will not be doing the minimum that they can do to protect their email and their consumers and their employees.
Yeah, great point. We are starting to see it be more broadly advertised, in the sense of people jumping on board and using it in more practical ways and getting out of just the choir, as you said. Want to show you an example of that. The best practice that OTA has advocated for a few years now is that you have SPF and DKIM at your top level domain, the one most likely to be spoofed, and that you have a DMARC enforcement record there as well. So you have a reject or quarantine as your policy in DMARC. And last year, about 4% of the 950 sites or so that we assessed had that. And this is a slide actually from last year's webinar on who had done that kind of trifecta, as we're calling it. And you can see that, there's some big names there, but it's somewhat sparsely populated. This year, we saw a huge growth. And these were the results from this year. Again, they're kind of segmented here by industry sector. So we have retailers on the left and consumer services on the right, banks and government in the middle, news on the lower left, and ISPs and hosters and email services on the lower right there. But you can see that there's been a big move, more than a doubling year to year, and we're starting to see more and more companies jump on board and really adopt this at a much higher level. We're going to go into this in a little more detail of our findings from the audit, but wanted to give you that sense here up front. So speaking of the audit, just want to give everyone a kind of a grounding and a context in what we looked at, so that when we talk about some of this data, you have a perspective on where it came from. So this is the 9th year that we've done the online trust audit. We typically divide it up by sectors, and sometimes we add sectors over the years. In this case, we added the ISP, carrier, and hoster sector. We bumped them all up to at least 100 this year, so we looked at retailers, banks, consumer services, and so forth. The Venn diagram on the right are the 3 areas that we look at, and I'll tell you about consumer protection because it's pretty much all about email authentication. We score this, and then we name people to the honor roll if they have an 80% score or higher and no failures in any one category. Failure this year being a score of 60. So it's kind of like school grades. This year across the board, consumer protection was the #1 reason for failure. Almost a third of the sites didn't have enough email authentication to have a passing grade. So it is the area of most concern, followed by privacy and then site security. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to conduct this webinar and focus on it. Looking inside the consumer protection area, the gray is our baseline points, the green are our bonus, and the red is penalty. And you can see that the baseline points are entirely made up of email authentication, SPF and DKIM, and then DMARC. and anything in italics is something that shifted from the previous year. So in this case, we did a couple things. We shifted the weight a little higher to the top level domain. We increased the weight for a reject policy versus just a quarantine policy. And we did a deeper analysis this year of the actual SPF and DMARC records. Not only do they exist, but are they valid? A lot of them, we're going to cover this in a few slides, a lot of them had errors of various kinds that disqualified them from being effective in their use. So we're kind of, each year we kind of raise the bar in terms of our methodology and how we assess these various things. So that actually impacted the scoring for a lot of companies pretty significantly. So looking at the adoption trends here, you can see that in general, there's a up and to the right growth of adoption of the various forms of email authentication, DMARC, DKIM, and SPF. Over the years, authentication at some level across the board is up in the 90s. We did see a dip this year in anything SPF related, mostly driven by the analysis of the SPF records themselves. And so about 7% of the sites had a faulty SPF record, about 10% of the SPF records, if you look at it that way. And because of that, we saw a dip because they were invalidated, whereas in previous years, they probably would have been counted as valid because they existed. So going from the top, it's any authentication at all at any level, top level domain or subdomain, and then going down any SPF anywhere, then SPF at the top level domain or the corporate domain and on down the line. If we look at DMARC, previously on this chart, which we used last year, we only showed whether the existence of a DMARC record. And this year we added the line of a DMARC enforcement. And you can see that it was kind of in the low single digit range there for the first few years, but it took a nice jump this year up into, I think it was 15 to 17% of the sites had a DMARC enforcement, which is great. So we're seeing the right kind of adoption trends here, and we hope to see that continue. So looking specifically by sector at the adoption, first we'll look at SPF and DKIM, and then on the next slide we'll look at DMARC. This again is at the top level domain. We also look at subdomains that we know of. It's hard to get a complete inventory from the outside of any company's email streams that they use. But SPF and DKIM allow you to verify who the sender is. Recommended that you implement it on outbound, which we can see, but also for inbound as well. That's hard for us to see from the outside, but that protects you from fake messages coming into your organization. And the recommendation again is to cover and protect all domains that are used for email, and even those that may be parked that aren't used for email. So you can see a somewhat wide range of adoptions across the different sectors. And I wanted to throw it out to our panelists. Why is it important to cover both the top level and the subdomains for your email with DKIM and SPF?
This is Peter. I can give an answer to that. At the end of the day, what you're attempting to do is your domain is a representation of your brand, right? If you're a company, that's what it is, and so you want to protect against any abuse of that brand. So the first step to doing that is making sure that legitimate usages of that brand are properly authenticated. So on your top level, your apex organizational domain, you want to make sure you're properly authenticated all of your email. That's typically where your mailboxes may lie. You have workflow services, things like that. Because that email is often communicating with consumers or other individuals who might be behind forwarding services, SPF is often not enough. You really want to have DKIM in place. But having both SPF and DKIM at that domain is helpful because receivers take SPF very seriously. Some of them actually weight it substantially higher than DKIM. And so having that complete authentication picture at your top level is important. Similarly, as Kevin mentioned earlier, for marketing emails, so marketing and to some extent transactional emails, it is not uncommon to see subdomains used as well. And those especially tend to be focused on consumers, where having DKIM in place is very important. Making sure that if the consumer is behind some sort of alumni address or forwarding address, the email that gets to them is authenticated, and SPF for a similar reason. And again, at the end of the day, the reason why you want to have all of that authentication in place is because that's what allows you to actually do DMARC enforcement. Email authentication at enforcement is an all or nothing thing. Either all of your legitimate email is authenticated, or you really can't go to enforcement because you're going to start blocking good email, which is the danger. So seeing that wide SPF and DKIM adoption at all levels where you send email is an important precursor to getting to that top level of behavior.
Great. So you sort of touched, my next question was going to be, why do you need to use SPF and DKIM? You sort of touched on that. Maybe Mike or Kevin, you could add a little more there of how they complement each other in terms of allowing receivers to figure out what's legitimate.
This is Mike. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. So without getting too much into the weeds of the technology, SPF and DKIM are separate standards that authenticate messages differently. So they both have their own strengths and weaknesses. So the value of doing them together is that where one might have an issue, the other might pick up the slack and help authenticate that message. So that to me, that's the primary value, is that you are authenticating the message in different ways, and you're actually, we've seen in very large deployments, customers get authentication rates that approach 100%. I'm talking 99.999% authenticated mail streams based on using both technologies, which is really outstanding and enables you to safely implement that DMARC enforcement policy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mike. And just based on really from the marketer's perspective, when we're sending emails, typically any deliverability concern or any area that we're triaged with when there is a bounce issue or a block issue, the first thing we're going to look at is that their SPF and their DKIM records are properly authenticated. That's typically one of the first questions that gets asked while you're trying to get through the gates of the receivers. So, if one is failing, there is potential that the other can pick up the slack, like you mentioned, and I think that's where having both obviously gives you the ability to then utilize a proper DMARC record. So again, kind of how I mentioned before, with moving forward, the internet service providers and the receivers are continuously evolving that portion. So more and more are becoming able to receive those and properly act on the overall DMARC authentication that you've provided, whether it's reject or quarantine. So being more prepared, utilizing both is definitely a huge win.
Great. So now if we move on to DMARC in particular, we see the adoption is even wider in terms of the size of the bars here. We've got just from a record standpoint, the federal government lagging at 20%, with consumer services sites at 62%. And then you can see the DMARC enforcement there on the right-hand side, the cluster of bars there. So we've talked about what DMARC does. It aligns your from address so that what the consumer sees is what's kind of under the covers. It allows you to get reporting, which we talked about on one of those value slides, and then you can tell the receiver how to handle messages. That's the enforcement thing, request or quarantine messages that fail. And we are seeing, as we said, a nice growth, as we saw on that chart with all the lines on it, of DMARC enforcement, but it's not nearly where it needs to be, still sub 20%. Overall. But a couple questions here to whoever wants to answer. What's the value of DMARC without enforcement? Why would you even use it without saying request or quarantine?
Oh, I can give an answer. This is Peter. So the short answer is, in the long run, there really isn't any real value of how it being at P equals none. P equals none as opposed to P equals reject or P equals quarantine, or more crucially being at enforcement all the way with no subdomain policy, etc., is really the gold standard. What P equals none is where you figure out what systems are sending email as you. It's where you get that initial visibility, and you can start identifying, oh, okay, this third-party service was turned on by the office in Denver, and this workflow service is sending email for payroll. And identifying all of those different services and getting them to a high level of authentication. Too many organizations, frankly, stop at the P equals none level. They generate reports. Those reports get sent to a processor. The processor puts them in the UI, and then, you know, once the initial, like, oh, we've put this in and we're going to look at this excitement has worn off, frankly, it really doesn't get looked at again. And especially since major receivers are overwhelmingly not sending what are called failure reports or forensic reports, which were kind of warning messages if something failed. Really, if you are a consumer of DMARC reports, you're looking backwards into the past. So you're looking at like what happened over the last 24 hours, the last 48 hours. And that's not a fantastically useful thing from a security posture. It might give you some information on the services that are running in your system, but again, in the long run, where you want to get is to DMARC at enforcement.
Okay, great. So what would be a typical start to finish if someone was, let's say they have SPF and DKIM in place at a level they think is good, and they want to add DMARC. So it sounds like it's useful to have P equals none at the beginning when you're kind of getting your act together, and then you can move to an enforcement level. But what does that timeline look like from the start of DMARC adoption and getting the reports to where companies are usually comfortable getting to some kind of enforcement level?
Well, there's kind of a lot of factors involved there, but it is critical to start out with the P equals none as opposed to going directly to the enforcement policy, just so even if you think you have all of your SPF and DKIM, all of your email covered by SPF and DKIM, you don't actually know that for sure until you start getting the report. So that's a critical first step, to analyze those reports for a little while at first. When you say start to finish, that's usually at a individual domain level. Most organizations for their brand own multiple brands or multiple domains, at least a medium to larger size organization. So when you say finish, I mean, to say you're finished that's almost never true in email security. You're always going to want to keep monitoring and looking for new traffic and things like that. But just to get to that initial enforcement policy with DMARC, I've seen large, complex domains get there in as short as 2 to 3 months. And then I've seen it take longer in the 6 months and longer time frame as well. A lot of it depends on the complexity of your domain and how many sources are sending email. Some organizations choose to consolidate the sources of email before they want to go to a enforcement policy, things like that. So it's a pretty wide range, but you know, as short as a couple months for a complex domain, up to over 6 months. An easier and quicker win is to protect all of your domains that don't send email, and that should happen almost immediately. As soon as you check your reports and know that I own this domain, I don't use it to send email, but it still represents my brand, I'm going to protect this one right away with an enforcement policy.
Great. That's a great point about protecting those domains and the ongoing nature. Agree with you that the job is never done, and that's one of the points I think we'll see when we look at the common mistakes here that we found in the audit. Yeah. Kevin, were you about to pitch in there?
This is Peter, and I actually wanted to build on something Mike said. It's really important. A lot of domains believe that their email is all SPF and DKIM authenticated, that they're fully at. A lot of domain owners are of this belief that effectively they just go to DMARC enforcement. Our experience is that that's basically almost never true. That usually there are services, it's more often than not the big marketing services, so it's not your yes mails, etc. But there are services that are running on your system that you don't know about. And because you don't know about them, they're not authenticating. And because they're not authenticating, if you go to DMARC enforcement, they will wind up being blocked. And so we frequently see workflow systems, internal, payroll, accounting, legal, HR, etc., have services that they're using that may not be visible, because if you're sending tens of millions of emails a day, are you really going to spot that system that's sending 5 to 10 per day? Probably not. And unless it's been brought to the attention of IT, you're never going to know about it. So having, taking a careful look at the DMARC output and understanding what services are sending as you is an important step, so that you can have real confidence that when you go to enforcement, you stay there. Because what happens for domain owners who don't do this, who don't get that level of confidence, is that they roll back. And it's much harder to get it in the second time around if you've been forced to roll back once.
Yeah, interesting. Great point. I was going to ask about the risks, and you hit on one of the big ones. If you jump to enforcement too soon, you're going to risk the mail that isn't properly authenticated being blocked.
I'll chime in on one kind of use case scenario as well here, because I think it's valuable for this slide. Is that everything that Mike and Peter just mentioned is bang on, and that the last thing any marketer really wants to have happen is getting a call from their customer service saying, "Hey, I'm getting spam to my email and it's coming from this address." And so there have been scenarios that we've kind of caught after the fact, because marketers weren't properly running a quarantine string on their DMARC record. So in that case, it puts a big fire behind getting this enforced. And to Mike's point, there should be a process involved of monitoring, but the last thing you want to have happen is you're under a fire of your CTO and everybody's seeing that there's a potential problem happening, and you don't have the necessary time to properly allocate resources and properly be able to look into it when it's kind of coming down at the last second there. So I think the being proactive and reviewing this in advance, there's no surprise these are going to happen and continue to happen, where malicious attacks are going to affect a ton of different marketers and different businesses. So being ahead of the 8 ball here, just in terms of getting it implemented is a large win as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. You don't want to be doing this in fire drill mode, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Anyway, so let's move on to the next slide, which kind of loops back to one of the earlier slides we had, looking at which of these organizations we audited this year were doing the trifecta: SPF and DKIM at the top level domain, and DMARC enforcement at that domain. And so you can see that with the side-by-side bars here, the growth in each of the industry segments. So roughly a doubling, or a little more than doubling overall, from 4 to 9%. You can see the consumer services sector didn't quite double, but impressive, growing from 16 to 28% of those. And you can kind of look across the board. This was the first year we did ISPs and hosts, so they're at 11%. And this is great to see, this kind of momentum. Just throwing it out to the panel, what's driving this, do you think, and how do we keep it going?
I think. Sorry, should I go?
No, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think some of the things we already talked about earlier in the presentation are driving the kind of the momentum here, and that is the publicity and the education level on DMARC itself and email authentication in general, and what's possible, how it's possible to protect your brand, protect your consumers, employees using DMARC is really getting out there now. And as more businesses do it and find success, they talk to other, CISOs talk to CISOs, security people talk to other security people, and there's word of mouth, and there's the policy mandates that are starting or proposed mandates, and those things all add up over time to push this momentum.
Great. Peter, did you want to toss something in here too?
Sure. I think one of the things I think we'll talk about a little bit later that is important here is that there's an increasing recognition that DMARC is not just for consumers. So one of the things that drives the high level of consumer compared to other categories on this slide is that, to the extent DMARC's been marketed as some sort of consumer or customer protect, and that's a very limited view of DMARC and email authentication in general. As I think that partners and employees part is important, And it's especially important as business email compromise has become a bigger and bigger threat to organizations. And so that drives a bunch of these different categories. And they're hearing it not only from, we mentioned earlier the UK Gov and FTC, both of which were mandates not directed just internally at the government, but externally at businesses in their respective policy areas. They're hearing this overall, this is a change that needs to be made. This is a way to protect yourselves. And as you see more and more news items, this is a place where the fear cycle, frankly, really drives, is you see companies getting sued by their own employees for leaking their W-2s, right? You see stories of wire fraud making the headlines. You see large corporations where C-level execs are getting pushed out because of problems with email. Do you really want to be the organization that didn't do this? That's what's really driving it, is there's a huge element of understanding now that this is a way to protect your customers, employees, and partners, to protect yourself internally, protect yourself externally, and that frankly, if you don't do it, there will be consequences.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you're referring to the Seagate with the employee suit against W-2s, right?
They're not the only one, but yes, they are the most prominent.
Yeah. So just to reinforce, these were the organizations that we saw this year that did abide by that best practice of the Trifecta. And we've already looked at this, but this is segmented by sector, just the way we saw it on the previous slide. So we are seeing great momentum there. To the point where pretty soon, I think Mike said this, or maybe it was Kevin, lost track, but at some point we're going to see where you're being left behind if you aren't doing this versus being on the front end and kind of an early adopter. So let's jump to some common mistakes we saw, and we're not going to look at these in detail. We're not going to try to analyze how would you fix each one of these, but at a high level, about 10% of the sites with SPF records were invalidated for a variety of reasons, and the list here is in kind of rank order of how often they occurred. So they were referring, pointing to other SPF records that were either non-existent or invalid. They had multiple SPF records concatenated into one, and so forth. The one that's in italics there, excessive lookups, we didn't invalidate this year in our scoring due to excessive lookups. We just tracked it as the first time we had looked at that because depending on how receivers process it, it may or may not have a big impact on things unless you go deep into those lookups. With DMARC, about 5% of records were invalidated. The number one reason was what we termed naked records, meaning they had a policy of none with no reporting. So essentially, it's a null DMARC record that has no value. I mean, you aren't even getting the reports back. So we didn't count those as proper DMARC records this year. And then syntax errors and pointing your records to places that weren't ready to receive them. So the bottom line that we came out with here was you really need to check your records. And there are a lot of ways to do that. A lot of our OTA members have record validators on their sites. The guys on the call here today do, as do several other OTA members. And we really encourage companies to be utilizing that, or you may have relationships with those kind of vendors who can do it on your behalf. We didn't look at DKIM here because you have to actually look at headers, so we didn't assess it in quite the same way, but there are obviously common mistakes you can make with DKIM as well because it is cryptographic in nature. There's a key handling element to it and a lot of syntax where mistakes can occur as well. Just wanted to toss out to the panel here, what kind of impacts would these, just at a high level, would these mistakes have? Like if your SPF record was there but invalid, or if your DMARC record was there but invalid, what impact would that have on your email?
I can take this. This is Peter. From SPF, it's actually it's very sensitive to the error, the receiver, and even within the same receiver, you may have different behavior. For example, if you have multiple SPF records on a single domain, that's actually a spec violation. It's supposed to be treated as perm error and just not authenticate any email that's coming from that domain with SPF. Some of the large receivers basically just take the first record that they get in the query and use that instead to adapt to the fact that there are so many domains that have multiple SPF records. This can have extremely unpredictable behavior if those records are not the same, because the record ordering is not fixed. So some of your email may authenticate properly because it's listed in one SPF record, and some may not. Effectively, SPF problems tend to be like that. They tend to be wild cards. Excessive lookups exceeding the domain lookup limit tends to be the same way. Depending on the receiver, the mail may authenticate, it may not. This is actually why it's so important to use record validators, as opposed to just looking at email and going, my message passed SPF, so I'm probably fine. That just basically affects in a very unpredictable way your email authentication for any given mail stream. On the DMARC side, it's a little bit less well defined. Obviously, if the record is naked, you might as well not have one. There's no point in having a P equals none record with no reporting. If you're doing that as a domain owner, you're probably doing that to kind of get your checkbox for I've got DMARC in place. And the receivers don't give that any credence. They're not interested in having an empty DMARC record there. Most syntax errors will invalidate the record, or at least invalidate the reporting. A very common syntax errors we see is malformed URIs in the aggregate reporting, or the forensic reporting, where, for example, the mail to is missing. That's extremely common as a syntax error, and basically it just breaks reporting for that case. And similarly, very frequently we see systems send records to places they're not set up to receive. And basically, that just means the reports won't be sent. Interestingly enough, many people who set up DMARC are under the impression they'll only get reports if something is wrong. They think all reports behave like failure reports, where it's only in the error case. And so they don't realize when they've got a syntax error or a configuration error that breaks reporting. They just think, oh, my mail's working as expected. Everything is fine. And so we have that conversation a fair amount. But that is a common error where you're simply not getting reporting. You don't get visibility. You have no actual benefit from DMARC.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if I up-level that a little bit, it's kind of like you have a false sense of security, right? You either think that your SPF and DMARC are working like you intended, and they aren't. And so maybe your messages are being tossed and you wouldn't even know it, or maybe they just aren't being protected as they should be, but you don't know. And so, and when you're pointing to other records, especially in the case of SPF, other people's SPF records, it's definitely a good discipline to be on top of checking that regularly, because their records may change over time. And so it's not just your own record that may be impacted there. So good points there. So let's move on to some looking forward, maybe some trends that you guys have seen going forward. So in some of our preparation for this webinar, these are the ones that you guys distilled out. So Peter, I think you already made the point about that initially DMARC was focused on consumer, but now is moving more into the enterprise world, that we've got both Google and Microsoft with their cloud services for enterprises implementing DMARC at all those levels, which is great, but we're also seeing it in the secure email gateways. You guys want to make a point about that, of use in the enterprise and what you're seeing there?
I think this is just a huge development over the last year to 2 years, because I mean, really, email authentication and DMARC work best the larger the ecosystem that supports it. So the more email receivers that will do the email authentication checks and honor your DMARC record, the more effective it is for you as a domain owner. As an enterprise, if you have an email gateway that can check DMARC on the inbound side, the more of your partners and your own domains coming inbound to you that you can check for email authentication and authenticate and take advantage of enforcement policies on the inbound side, the better it is for you as an email receiver. So it just, the more adoption we see like this from the secure email gateways, the bigger the ecosystem is and the more effective the protection is.
Great. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think, from a high level, point of view for this slide, the notable trend is just that there are continuous evolutions of DMARC here, and continuous onboarding of making this more available to brand marketers or for senders and receivers. So I think, there was probably a bit of a perception, maybe even a few years ago, that it's not something we have to worry about right now. But the adjustments and forward thinking that's been happening within the industry really pushes the envelope for marketers and for everyone to start to look at this a little bit more. And we've seen that with some of the percentages. So I think just the evolution of where these new items are coming in are really telling a good story for the longevity of DMARC.
Great point. So what about ARC? We don't want to go into the technical bits and bytes there, but what is that? It's kind of a new proposal that's tied to DKIM. Mike or Peter, one of you want to take that?
I can take that. Yeah, so, when DMARC was rolled out, one of the negative impacts it had was on mailing lists. You can do a simple search on DMARC and break mailing list. It also broke some forwarders that were not respecting DKIM. And ARC is an attempt to, a standard under development at the IETF, that is an attempt to fix this problem, to basically identify trusted sources of forwarded mail, whether those be mailing lists or forwarders who've broken DKIM, and allow them to establish a chain of custody with the original email authentication. And this is, for some organizations, this is a very big deal. For others, it doesn't tend to matter very much, but it's a way to basically make DMARC an appropriately universal standard that any organization can roll out with confidence.
So it's kind of covering one of the gaps DKIM has had, kind of close that gap, or the edge case, you might say.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Now, what about this last one? It's worded pretty vaguely. Ongoing developments to build on authentication for identifying senders. Who wants to address what's going on there?
Well, I think at a high level on this one, the idea is that since the development of DMARC, there is a way for brands to specify an enforcement policy that says don't accept or don't deliver to the end user messages that fail authentication. But how do you positively identify to the users the ones that I did authenticate so that they see a difference? And that's actually not part of DMARC, but there are efforts out there in the industry going on where brands and receiving organizations are getting together to talk about ways that what can we do to help our users positively identify stuff that did authenticate, so that we have both sides of the equation working there. We'll reject stuff that doesn't authenticate, but then we'll also tell the users when something did authenticate so they can have even more trust in those messages.
Gotcha. So some positive reinforcement of what's in your inbox that has been authenticated.
And one more item on top of that, of way some of these sender identification proposals are structured, is they're also supposed to be the carrot for the domain owners. So, we've talked a lot about kind of protecting yourself, and to some extent that's a fear motivation. We've talked about it's just going to be expected for your deliverability. But this is a way for brand owners, those logos that you put on the slide of the honor roll, to basically get their brand logos in front of their own consumers on a regular basis. And so they're very excited about that. It's a motivation for them to get to that highest level of email authentication, and is basically yet another push that can be beneficial to the whole ecosystem.
Great. So I want to kind of loop back to, we talked about value at the beginning, and one of the questions we get a lot at OTA is, well, how do I justify this internally in my organization? Because sometimes it feels a little bit fuzzy. So I wanted to kind of loop back and look at those three main value points in the context of what we just talked about, and have you guys address each one. So Mike, you want to take that first one on security and how you can use that to justify the efforts internally to implement all this stuff?
Sure, you bet. So normally when we see an organization take on a project to implement DMARC and get to an enforcement policy with DMARC, it's usually driven by their security organization. Now, of course, it involves other areas in the corporation like IT and marketing and such, but it's usually security driving it. And the justification is usually to say, hey, we have a problem with either our consumers or our employees being phished and abusing our brand and our domains, and we want to stop that. And this is a way that we have to shut down that problem through authentication and DMARC. So that's usually the justification. And we have seen time and time again, when organizations implement this, the bad guys do go elsewhere. I mean, the criminals usually don't throw up their hands and just go get a new job once one of their attack vectors gets shut down. But you always want to shut down the things that you can and shut down the most effective modes of their abuse. And by shutting down the exact domain phishing problem for your brand and your domains, you're taking away probably their most effective way of doing that.
Great. Peter, you want to address that second one, the insight?
Sure. So, we talked a bit about this earlier, that frankly, most organizations don't have a great grasp of who's sending email on their behalf, especially in today's world, which is, very different from even a few years ago. Organizations are increasingly taking what used to be core business functions and outsourcing those to cloud organizations that may be performing services that were back office. Accounting, finance, legal, HR, additional services that may be bespoke to that company. But you have all of these different services, and what ties them together is that to establish their reputation, to associate themselves with the company, they send email using the company's domain. Most companies that do this have policies in place that these have to run through IT or legal, the use of these cloud services, but in practice that often doesn't happen. And frankly, there's no way for your IT team or your CISO to know that this is the case until you do email authentication. DMARC gives you that kind of visibility. You can see all of the different services, and that sometimes these third-party services, it may be that someone on your HR team is running a recruiting mailing list off a server in the office. It may be that you've got printers connected to the open internet that send quarterly reports. You can see all of this, while previously as an IT team you were blind, and that gives you the ability to meet a higher level of compliance to ensure that you have a higher level of security, and that's good for the whole organization. On the other side of it, you have people who are basically attackers. They're phishers. They're abusing your domain. They're either sending spear phishing attacks against your employees, your partners, maybe your customers. They're sending, they're just using your domain. They're free riding off it for spam. With email authentication, you can see who they are, you can see where they are, and once you get to enforcement, you cannot worry about it too much anymore. But you'll have a good idea of who's sending, who's abusing your domain. And our experience is, frankly, that pretty much every domain that's been around for any lengthy period of time, when you actually do a DMARC report and you start analyzing who's sending, there's very obvious abuse, sometimes large, sometimes small. But once you've picked up that rock and seen what's underneath it, it's pretty hard to forget what you've seen.
Yeah, good point. Kevin, how about that last one, deliverability?
Yeah, I think the area in terms of once you start to recognize, or if you do recognize that there are areas of malicious attacks on your domain, there's typically a direct result in your deliverability performance. So a use case we've had in the past where when DMARC was just becoming a new item, we had a marketer specifically that had consistent blocks at various different ISPs. And after utilizing just a DMARC policy to start to recognize, once we got to reject, it automatically stopped. So we were able to get those blocks lifted, and really the deliverability performance and the brand recognition started to increase for that marketer. So there's kind of two parts to that. One, it's a direct reinforcement of who you are to the industry. And two, as this continues to grow, become more valuable for all marketers and all senders, the window shrinks for people that aren't doing it. And I think to Mike's point, the malicious attacks aren't really going to stop, and they won't put their hands up. They'll just jump to the next person that's not authenticated. So your window of opportunity as a marketer or a sender, it starts to really shrink as we'll likely see. You know, if you're not authenticated and you don't have a DMARC reject in place, you become a more valuable vulnerability at that point. So I think there's, you know, in terms of a direct correlation to how it improves your overall reputation and health, there's just an obvious coinciding there, and how it really pushes you forward into the other areas here, so security and even governance, and really doing what's right for the email industry. As you know, we still see that there are fairly low adoptions, but I think, you know, as marketers take awareness that this is their industry, they're able to, you know, make sure that the authentication practices are put into place in order to drive that forward and keep moving and evolving. So I think that's probably, you know, the easiest way to put it.
Great. So we're just a couple minutes to the hour, so I'm going to just kind of rush through this slide, and maybe we'll have a chance for 1 or 2 questions at most. But this is kind of the call to action slide. After hearing all this, the typical kind of flow would be to do a self-assessment. What is your email inventory? Who are your stakeholders, and so forth. Get help. OTA has a lot of resources on our website, through our members and such. Build a business case based on the values, especially that last slide that we just talked through, of protection and insight and deliverability, and then start to implement and put this in place. These are a subset of the list of tools and resources available. Some of the links on the OTA site directly, some of the OTA members that are directly involved with DMARC and email authentication, some of whom are on the panel today. Wanted to give each of you just if you can do a real brief summary of, you know, if you wanted to take away 1 point from today and what people should be thinking about, what would it be? Peter, let's start with you, and then do Mike and Kevin.
You're going to put me on the spot.
Yeah.
So my one takeaway is that you should be looking at your domains and be focusing on getting them to enforcement. That it's not enough to just put in a DMARC record at P equals none and call it a day. Your focus should be getting to enforcement, and at this point, there's a clear wave developing behind that.
Great. Mike, how about you?
So my biggest takeaway is that DMARC and getting your brands and domains protected with a DMARC enforcement policy is no longer experimental. It's not the brand new thing anymore. It's actually pretty mature. It's adopted broadly. The awareness is becoming rapidly increasing, and everyone should be doing this. There's really no excuse to not to have a project in your plan in the next year to be implementing DMARC on your domains.
Great. Kevin, how about you?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the main takeaway is that if any of the information shared in today's webinar is completely over your, I think there's a ton of resources out there that are able to, and a ton of experienced people in the industry now with DMARC and authentication. So there's a quick way to make a process. And if you're not in the position to understand it, contact any of the people that are a part of the OTA, or build those connections in order to start to look into your authentication, because really there's an uptick over the last few years for everything that we discussed today, and I can't see it being retracted or going on a downward slope, just in general for your protection. So I think that's the main takeaway for me. Great.
So yes, help is available. So just wrap up on the housekeeping side, I want to thank everybody for attending today. The slides as a PDF file and the recording of the webinar itself will be available on the OTA site shortly. And we want to thank everyone for listening in and participating in the webinar. And I want to thank the panelists as well, Mike and Peter and Kevin, for their insights and expertise. So thank you very much, everyone.